Raise the flag.
Light the cauldron. We declare the game's Odyssey open.
Welcome to the Games Odyssey podcast, your home for stories of glory from Olympia to now. I'm Jonathan Jordan.
And I'm Sarah Patton. We both love the Olympics and Paralympics, and we love history. And most of all, we love Olympic and Paralympic history because in a lot of ways, it ends up being world history too.
Yeah, in our last episode, we talked about the mess that was the Paris Games in 1900, or what I lovingly refer to as the What Olympics, since the organizers literally went out of their way to not advertise the Olympic Games. But that doesn't mean that it was all bad. So we're going to talk about the silver lining a little bit today because it became the first Olympics where women were allowed to compete, something that Pierre de Coubertin was very much against. But the poster that is now recognized as the official poster of the Paris Games features a female fencer, which is also a little bit funny considering the fact that fencing was not one of the five sports that allowed female athletes, but whatever, we'll still take it. So today we're doing our second athlete profile episode, except we decided to cover two athletes in this episode. The first two women to become Olympic champions, one as part of a mixed team and the other as the first individual champion. So these women are a part of what I like to call Club Kyneska. Sarah, you remember Kyneska, right? For listeners who maybe haven't listened to the first couple episodes, can you refresh us on who she was?
Yeah, so you just put me on the spot. Now it's all running together for me, so thank you for that.
Sorry.
No, kindness. So Kyniska, she was a Spartan princess, and she was essentially the first female Olympian. She was famous for being the first woman to officially win at the Olympics.
Yeah, so Kyniska has become one of my favorite people, period, in all of history because she was just so clever. So, if you haven't listened to our first couple episodes about what we call the OG Olympics, the ancient Olympic Games, you probably at least know the basics of the ancient games and the fact that only men were allowed to compete. But Kyniska figured out this really fun and crazy loophole because the Chariot Race event was a little bit different than the other events that they featured, simply because it wasn't the driver of the chariot who was considered the champion. It was whoever owned the horses that won. So you could literally be an Olympic champion and not even be at the Olympic Games because if they were your horses and you entered them and they won, then you were considered the victor. So Kyniska was so bright, so clever, just an amazing lady that she figured out I can enter my horses and I can become an Olympic champion, which apparently had been her dream since being a little girl. So she exploited that loophole. She became the first female Olympic champion in all of history. And then just to rub it into all the men's faces, she built a statue of herself at Olympia to remind the generations that followed who she was and that she could be just as much a champion as the men. So we're big fans of Kyniska here on our show.
which honestly, the fact that she built a statue, now it's all coming back to me, but the fact that she built a statue for herself is maybe my favorite part. I mean, yeah, sure, outwitting everyone else to become an Olympic champion, I respect that, but just to have the confidence to build a statue of yourself, like, I love that.
We're not advocating everyone go out and build a statue of yourself. That's maybe a little bit too far.
Of course not.
She earned the right to build a statue of herself.
She did.
So these women that we're going to be talking about today, I consider them a part of Club Kyniska because they are legends in their own right for becoming the first female Olympic champions of the modern Olympic movement. But We don't have a ton of highlights because we're really just talking about their story. But Sarah, who are we going to be talking about first?
First, we're going to be talking about Elena De Portales, who became the first woman to both compete in and win a medal in the modern Olympics.
Yeah. And then we're going to chat a little bit about Charlotte Cooper of Team GB, who was a dominant tennis star and trailblazer in her own right. There was some really cool stuff I learned about her that I did not know before doing the research, and I'm excited to talk about it. But first, let's take just a little bit of a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk about Elena.
All right, so we're going to start with talking about Elena De Portales, who I find really fascinating. She was born as Helen Barbie on April 28th, 1868, in New York City, and that's where she spent much of her childhood. Since we're recording in April, her birthday is coming up, so we'll have to remember that to give her a shout out on her birthday.
Yeah.
She was the daughter of Mary Lorillard Barbie, a prominent member of high society in New York during the famous Gilded Age. And no, this is not an ad for the HBO series, by the way. But if you're familiar with the Gilded Age, you can think Barbie's grandfather was lots of ritz, glamour, and he established the Lorillard Tobacco Company and was also a real estate tycoon. I guess side hustles are not that new of a thing. But a fun fact that we learned about Pierre over here is that the term millionaire was first used to describe him. So I don't know. I think that's a pretty legendary thing to be one of the first millionaires and to have that term described to you for the first time. I mean, that's so interesting to me.
I would love for someone to describe me as a millionaire. That'd be great.
I know. We could take this podcast to new heights. So yeah, Helen was definitely not suffering as a child. She must have had some nice little perks. I not to get into politics, but I'm thinking like this like modern day Trump family before I don't know if that's a good example, but just like lots of money, New York high society, lots of glam, just yeah. Growing up, the Barbie family used to spend their summers on vacation in Europe, totally casual.
Oh, yeah.
Including in Western Switzerland, where they own some land. I mean, don't we all own land in Europe somewhere?
Sure.
According to a blog we found about her, they say the life of the young Elena Barbie revolved around clothes, formal dinners, balls, and handsome cavaliers. So, I mean, a lot like, normal teenagers that get obsessed with clothes, maybe, and fashion, all the things. But I'm sure she had some really fancy clothes and balls to go to. She picked up her love of boating in particular from hanging around the likes of eccentric baroness, because, again, we all hang out with, these barons and baronesses.
Yeah, sure.
Baroness Julie von Rothschild and Empress Elizabeth of Austria. So yes, super cash.
Yeah, we all know an empress or two. So sure.
Again, like the more that I read about her, I'm just so fascinated with her life.
Yeah.
I want the movie for this.
Yeah, it's like, what is your life?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yep. Elena's father was Henry Isaac Barbie, and he was a cousin of Charles Oliver Iselin. He went by Oliver. And why would we care about this random guy that was her dad's cousin? Because Oliver just so happened to be an accomplished yachtsman, having won 6 consecutive America's Cup races. Now, I don't know a whole lot about boating, but I know that America's Cup is a really big deal.
Yeah.
After Oliver's first wife died, he married Hope Goddard, who was the first woman to be part of the crew on a yacht during the America's Cup in 1894. So women doing things for the first time seems to be a thing for this family, which is going to bring us back to Elena De Portales. So I find that really interesting that she, like, boating was part of her family culture.
Yeah.
And, you know, it still is kind of, the part of me that is not in this world, I don't want to be judgmental, but I just always assume that yachting and boating is kind of a rich people sport. Some things never change, but it was very much part of her family culture. Um, Cousins, extended family, everybody.
Yeah.
So going back to Elena, the Lorillard were central figures in the Newport community where America's Cup regattas were held in that era. In one of her diaries, which was later sold at an auction, Elena provides a vivid description of watching the 1887 America's Cup. So she was always interested in this
Yeah.
stuff, even from a spectator point.
Yeah.
So, how did this New York City socialite end up competing for Switzerland at the Olympics? Because, yeah, she didn't even compete for the US.
Yeah.
On April 25th, 1891, so see, her anniversary is coming up too. Helen married Hermann Alexander, Count de Portales, the son of Alexander and Augusta Saladin, who came from an old Huguenot family. Those Huguenots go way back in Europe, but you might have slept through that particular class back in high school. So, yeah, there's some history there. Fascinating. Look it up.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to get into it. But, so yeah, she married Count de Portales, like a count. No big deal.
I was just going to say, better that she married Count de Portales than Count Dracula.
I mean, yeah.
You know, good move on her part.
The wedding took place in the American Church of Saint Trinité in Paris. I believe it was from this moment forward she became known as Elena instead of Helen. I'm assuming this is also when she decided to compete for the Swiss, but we're going to get into that here in a minute. Hermann was born and raised into a French family in Switzerland after they settled there, following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. Long story short, they were Reformed Protestants and were part of a religious community being persecuted. So he had French heritage. Hermann worked in the service of the King of Prussia as a captain in the Garde Cuirassier. It's a fancy word that means dude holding a sword while riding a horse. So if that were an Olympic sport, I guess he'd be all right at it.
Yeah.
And then Elena maintained a. So she kept her passport to be Switzerland and the United States, but would go on to represent Switzerland. So here we've got possibly our first really well-documented case of someone representing a country where they were not born, but later became a citizen, like recent winter gold medalist and monobob Kaylee Humphreys, who switched from Canada to compete for the U.S., or Eileen Gu, who was born in the U.S. but represented China.
Mm-hmm.
So that's setting the stage for her Olympic endeavors.
Yeah. And, you know, she's, again, we say possibly the first really well documented case of this happening, because there were athletes in those, you know, the 1896 games who were from different countries, but they were competing with another country, and it gets a little fuzzy because the record keeping wasn't great. So there may have been other athletes who represented a country where they weren't born before her, but this was a situation where, yeah, it was actually documented, and understandably, you know, competed with her family. I don't know that we can really hold that against her, right?
Right, absolutely. And I mean, it's obvious she wasn't thinking like, well, let me marry so that I can do this, but yeah.
Right.
So
absolutely.
yeah, really interesting. Just her whole upbringing. Again, like, I think her marriage is obviously a product of the circles that she ran in because of her upbringing with her family.
Yeah, I mean, that was just normal life for her.
Right. You know, go hang out on the family land in Switzerland, casual. So now this brings us to 1900. So in 1900, Elena Hermann and Hermann's nephew, Bernard de Portales, teamed up and decided to enter their Swiss boat, Lorena, into the Olympics. Hermann was the helmsman and Elena was the skipper. I'm not sure what Bernard did. Maybe he was the water boy. Important job, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Their qualifying race was on May 20th and started in Moulins on an expanse of water that was maintained by the Paris Yacht Club. To qualify for the medal event, any boat less than 10 tons had to finish the race, which featured a total of 65 yachts that had to cover a distance of 11 kilometers or 6.8 miles. It's reported there was only a light breeze that day, which means that winning really came down to technical skill. The Portales crew was accustomed to dealing with the temperamental weather on Lake and not only qualified for the medal event, but Geneva won the event. Fun fact, their boat was assigned the starting number of 22, which incidentally is also the number of women competing in the 1900 games. So, fun little history.
Yeah.
And then speaking of 22, on May 22nd, they lined up for the start along with quite a few others who had also qualified. This time, they'd be sailing a 19-kilo course, which is 11.8 miles, which would also require a lot of technical skill. But Elena, Hermann, and Bernard won again. So she officially became both the first woman to take part in the Olympics and the first female gold medalist. I mean, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And we can recognize that it's because her event came first that she was the first woman to take part, but still, big deal. I wonder if she fully grasped that moment, if she really understood everything that was going on, that she would have such a legacy as the first female to compete and win.
Yeah, it's difficult to know if there was any real weight to that moment or if honestly it was just another day out on the boat. Right?
Yeah. Because we know that she loved it and the Olympics were still so young.
Yeah.
So anyway, not to be stopped, Elena also became the first female double medalist as their crew went on to take silver in the next sailing event too. Elena also competed in the open class, but she did not finish. Regardless, she would be the only female medalist for 2 months, but more on that later.
Hey, she held that record for 2 months. So
yeah, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
While at the Olympics, she apparently also watched the golf tournament since her husband's cousin Jacques was working as a referee for the course, according to our friends at Olympedia. Great website. Since boating was considered very fashionable at the time, she had some short-lived but remained largely unknown around the rest of the sports world. Hermann passed away just a few years later on November 28th, 1904, at the age of 57. So their sweet little European love story unfortunately came to an end just 4 years later. Elena would continue to live in Europe, splitting her time between her homes in both Geneva and Paris, but living pretty anonymously up to her passing on November 2nd, 1945 in Geneva at the age of 77. Unfortunately, because she was a pioneer in women's athletics, she competed at a time where most people just really didn't care about women in sports, so there wasn't much written about her accomplishments. I wish we had more that we could say about her, but that's also why it's important to tell her story, to honor her legacy, even though, honestly, not many people cared about her at the time. And I will say that, I spent a lot of time looking, okay, she had a diary that was sold at an auction. Where's the diary? Surely it can tell us more stuff. And trying to figure out her later life. And I think I read something about, she had a stepson who got married in New York later on in her life, and that the American president was there. And so, I mean, she clearly ran in these high up social circles. But yeah, it's a shame that we don't really know what the rest of her life looked like. I wish that we could find her diary. So if you're listening
Yeah.
to this and you see her diary up for auction and you have a lot of money, let us know.
Yeah. Well, and I think we have to remember too, this is kind of the tough part of being a trailblazer is you don't realize a lot of times that you are being a trailblazer. Like she was just going boating because she loved boating. She wasn't trying to make a statement. She wasn't trying to accomplish something big. As you already said, you know, most of the people didn't even realize they were competing in the Olympics. So it's not like she was thinking, "Oh, I could be the first female, Olympic champion." Right? Like that wasn't she was just doing what she loved.
Mm-hmm.
And in some
Right.
ways that's a great story because I know I've listened to so many interviews from Olympic athletes who talk about how they put too much pressure on themselves when they get to the Olympic Games because it's such a big deal now and because it's this dream that they've had
Right.
that sometimes they have to play this game with themselves to just remember, hey, I'm here because I love running, I love archery, I love figure skating, whatever, insert whatever sport it is. A lot of times they just have to get into a headspace where they remember, I'm just doing something I enjoy doing and try to forget the pressure of the moment. So, I think it's important to remember that with her story that,
Yeah.
yes, she was a history maker, she was a trailblazer, but she was also just a woman going out and spending time with her family and doing what she loved. And that's commendable too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, I really enjoyed learning about her. If I'm being completely
Yeah.
honest, I'm a little salty that being a big Team USA fan, little salty that we didn't get to claim the first female Olympic champion, but it's okay. It's okay. No, she fell in love, did what she needed to
Yeah.
do. So I'm just being a little silly, but yeah,
Yeah.
fascinating woman.
Yeah. I mean, she was born here, even if the medal gets to get ratcheted up for Switzerland. She still was one of our own. So you can look at it that way. but yeah, she's, we're not ending the episode here,
Yeah.
obviously, since we don't know a ton more about her. We're gonna also talk about the first individual female Olympic champion of the modern movement, but we're gonna take a quick little break and then we'll come back and talk about Charlotte Cooper.
Alrighty.
All right, so let's talk about Charlotte Cooper. So she was born September 22nd, 1870, in Middlesex, England. And during her storied career in tennis, which we will get into in a second, she would end up winning 5 singles titles at Wimbledon, in addition to becoming the first individual female gold medalist at the Olympic Games. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We'll kind of rewind the tape a little bit and talk a little bit about her background that led up to these accomplishments. So, Charlotte was born to Henry Cooper, who worked as a miller, and Teresa Georgina Miller, which I found kind of funny. So her dad was a miller, and then her mom was also a miller, but in name only. But anyway, Charlotte learned how to play tennis at the local Ealing Lawn Tennis Club. It was apparently something to do as a family. So here we go, Sarah. We just talked about Elena
Mm-hmm.
and how boating was a family sport and activity for them. So same thing for Charlotte here. They were constantly playing tennis apparently because she spent a lot of time at the club playing with her sister when they were young. Oh, and apparently her family nickname was Chatty, which I suppose that's just a cute shortened version of Charlotte, not necessarily a knock on her being talkative. Either way, it's a cute nickname. So um, Charlotte's natural abilities at
Yeah.
tennis were noticed by a coach named H. Lawrence, and then later on, she was also coached by Charles Martin and Harold Mahoney, who helped her, especially with her mental game, as far as tennis was concerned. So, not just the physical side of it, but just her mindset and how she approached the game and not letting things get to her, which again is a huge thing in tennis because the games can go on so long that it's not just about the physicality. It's also about not letting that, that missed ball or that bad stroke throw you off from your game. So it's cool that she was being trained in that. Now, she won her first senior singles title in 1893, wearing a dress, by the way.
Oh, of course.
Again, I've never played tennis, but I mean, Sarah, talk me through that a little bit. How tricky would that be?
Oh, it would be so tricky. I mean, and I know that we have tennis skirts now and all that,
Mm-hmm.
but the tennis skirts look very different than the type of dress that little Chatty would have played in. And
Yeah.
I cannot imagine like running. So when you play tennis, and remember, I've only played very recently, but you
Yeah.
run up, you run back, you run sideways, and that would be very, very difficult. So I guess it kind of reminds me of that old quote that's like, what was it? That Ginger would do anything backwards in high heels. Like to be a woman, you basically have to do what a man could do, but backwards in high heels.
Yeah.
I feel kind of like that. I mean, I know that men probably wore suits and all that stuff back then too, but anyway,
Yeah.
props to Charlotte because that sounds ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, all women would have been wearing a dress. So it's not like she was doing something different than her competitor. But I'm just thinking of, again, the
Well,
physicality of
yeah,
the sport, and you just can't move quite as easily in it. But
right. Oh, yeah. I mean, and we know that even aside from tennis, that was the thing back then is that
right.
you had to be fully dressed and whatnot. But still,
Yeah.
I'm so glad we've come so far.
Yeah. Absolutely. But from 1893 to 1917. So that's a good chunk of time there. That's over 20 years. She competed in 21 Wimbledon tournaments. She defeated player Helen Jackson to win her first singles tournament in 1895, even though she was down 0-5 in both sets. But then she managed to win straight sets after that. So it looks like her mental game training really came into play there to be that far down and still be able to say, nope, I'm gonna win this match. I'm doing it. So good for her.
Yeah, it's really impressive.
And I, even though I've watched a lot more tennis recently than what I used to, I still get really confused by the scoring, and even I'm impressed by that with the bit that I understand of the scoring. But from there on, in both 1895 and in 1898, she won the singles title at the Irish Lawn Tennis Championships, which was considered a very prestigious tournament back at that time. So it was a big deal that she won, and tennis was already popular at this time. So she's starting to kind of build a name for herself. And then, according to the research that I did, thanks to our friends at good old Wikipedia, she was known to have an aggressive style of play, attacking the net whenever she got the chance. And at the time, she was one of only a few women who served overhead. So I found that really interesting that she was doing a style that at the time was really mostly known for men, and that she was like, I don't care. I'm going to do it because it's a better way to play and I can win games like this. So she was also known for her steadiness, for her poise, again, her mental game, which makes, sense given some of the comebacks that we just mentioned. So she was very good about just not getting riled no matter what was happening in the game and being able to have these awesome comebacks. In fact, tennis journalist Arthur Wallace once wrote that her volleying skills were so great that when she played in doubles matches, he noticed that she could actually rival most of the male players of the time. So she did occasionally play mixed doubles, and he was like, wow, she can hold her own against the male player that she's opposing, which is really impressive, especially since she was in a dress.
Yeah, which, Jonathan, you said that you've never tried tennis before, right?
Correct.
Okay. So volleying, uh, yeah, it can be scary at first.
Mm-hmm.
I personally love volleying, and I'm not going to pretend to be as skilled as someone like Charlotte Cooper. But I love volleying because I like to get a little aggressive, and it reminds me of playing volleyball
Mm.
when you get up on the net and just smack the ball back down. But all that to say, that totally makes sense what Arthur Wallace wrote about her, with her being known for having an aggressive style of play, because yeah, she wasn't going to wait for the balls to come to her. She was going to go after
Yeah.
them and make her opponents suffer. So I like her.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, and at this point in the research, I felt the same way. Like, man, she's really awesome. I really love her story and her accomplishments. And then I came up to this fact about her life, which just completely changed the conversation. Because it's really important to note that somewhere around 1896, Charlotte actually went completely deaf. So that means at the time of the 1900 Paris Games, she'd been competing for at least 4 years as a deaf, as a disabled athlete in a time where, frankly, that just wasn't even an idea, right? If you had a disability at that day and age, then you just sat at home. Basically, that's the attitude people had. But in fact, the last time she was able to report that she could hear the balls hitting the court when playing was when she won her first singles tournament in 1895. So essentially, she was able to kind of hear the very first time she won the singles tournament. And then from there on out, she had no hearing to be able to gauge how hard the ball was hitting the ground. And, I did a little bit of research on this since I have not played tennis, but, Sarah, you can clarify this a little bit. But I feel like being able to hear the ball can give you so much information in terms of how you need to move on the court. Am I off about that?
Well, I think that you're probably right on that. I'm not good enough to be able to tell you if that matters, but what I can
Mm-hmm.
say is that, and again, this is very much from a beginner standpoint, so probably not something that Charlotte had to think about. But whenever I first was learning how to swing the racket, the coach that was teaching me would tell me that I could kind of tell how my opponent would hit the ball, and I could tell how I would hit the ball based on the sound of the ball hitting the racket.
Yeah.
So I definitely paid attention to the sound of the ball in the racket, not so much on the court, but I'm sure that at a certain level, I'm sure that that does matter. But as beginner old me, I just was hoping to get to the ball. So I wasn't
Yeah.
paying attention to sounds.
No, I mean, what you're saying is consistent with what I was reading of, this one article I ran across where they were making a point of, yes,
Mm-hmm.
you can play tennis obviously as a deaf person and you can just keep your eye on the ball, right? but it was talking about there is a lot of kind of subconscious information you get from the sound of the ball if you play a lot, in terms
Mm-hmm.
of velocity and direction, as you were saying, like the sound off the racket. And so that for her to be able to be so skilled that she didn't need that sense anymore, to be able to obviously be effective in what she did, it is really commendable in of itself. So, but
Yeah. And this is something that we'll never know. This is just, yeah. One thing I would be curious is I think about musicians that have lost their
mm,
hearing and how they've talked about how they can use their feet to like help them with, I guess, the vibrations or something like that, like they can sense it. I guess I don't really know what I'm talking about since I'm struggling for words, but that their other senses become a lot stronger, and that's what helps them when it comes to still being able to play music even though they can't hear. And so
yeah.
I'm curious, like, if something like that happened for her. And again, I think she was so skilled, like what you said, that
Right.
she didn't need maybe those other senses to come a lot stronger than what they already were. Like she was so good, and especially with her aggressive playing style.
Yeah.
But again, I'm curious. Like I would love to know that. I don't think we ever will, but I would love to know if something else was strengthened after she lost her hearing. If
Yeah,
that makes sense. Does that make sense?
it does make sense. But this is why I kind of teed her up as being a trailblazer in more way than one, right? Is because she was competing. Yeah, she was competing as a disabled athlete at a time where you just didn't see many people doing that,
Yeah,
and
definitely.
she wasn't going to let that hold her back, and she proved she could be the best, regardless. We should probably talk about the Olympic Games since that tends to be the focus of this show. So Charlotte goes to Paris to compete in the Olympic Games, though again, who knows if she actually knew what she was competing in. She just thought, hey, another tennis tournament, right? So she's going to go play in it. So she goes to Paris, and whether she knew it was the Olympics or not, on July 11th, she defeated French tennis player Elena Prevost in straight sets to win the entire tournament, making her the first individual female modern Olympic champion. Whew, that was long, but still amazing. And it also made her the first Olympic champion, at least that we know of, the first Olympic champion with a disability, about 60 years before the start of the Paralympic movement. And not to be outdone by Elena De Portales, I guess, she paired up with Reginald Doherty for the mixed doubles event for the Olympic Games, where they went on to also win gold. So she became the first dual gold female medalist at those games. And she didn't actually receive a gold medal for either event at the time, kind of like we've talked about before. But from the research that I did, it sounds like she did receive one later on. Uh, it was a little fuzzy what I was reading, but
Mm-hmm.
it sounded like for whatever reason, I guess the World's Fair people didn't want them given medals there at the time, but apparently the IOC did give them out later on. So there you go. She did get an actual medal.
Good. As they should. Good.
So the following year, she married Alfred Sterry, who was a solicitor who also became the president of the Lawn Tennis Association. So I guess it was tennis that brought them together. And then she became Charlotte Cooper Sterry at that point. So sometimes you'll see her just listed as Charlotte Cooper. Sometimes you'll see her listed as Charlotte Sterry. Sometimes you'll see her as Charlotte Cooper Sterry. Same person.
Okay, but I can't miss this. I can't miss this opportunity, Jonathan. So if tennis brought them together, you would say for them
Mhm.
it was all about love, tennis, love, the score. Whenever,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah,
it's a tennis pun. Come
yeah.
on,
See,
help me out here.
again, I'm showing my weakness in my knowledge of the sport because I know that's a term, but it didn't click right away for me. So, yes, love brought them together.
It's okay.
Gotcha.
I had to take a swing at it.
I mean,
Just
I mean, what's that thing? If you have to explain a joke, it gets funnier, right? The more you explain the joke, the funnier it is.
I would hope.
In this case, you just had a bad audience member,
Yes.
so yeah, I was not the right crowd for that one.
Had to try.
So another kind of cool thing about Charlotte is she did take a 7-year break from tennis. So from 1901 to 1908, during that time, she was focusing on birthing and raising 2 children. Little humans take up a lot of time and energy. We both know that. Her children's names were Rex and Gwen. And both of them, of course, took up tennis later on, as if they had any choice in that family. They probably just kind of had to. It was just part of who they were as a family. But then, like the total boss that she was, Charlotte went right back out in 1908 and won in straight sets for the all comers title. That would be her last singles victory at the age of 37. And she's still one of only 4 women to win Wimbledon after having given birth. So, uh, you know, definitely a very elite specific club of women who can claim that. She's also, to this day, she is still the oldest Wimbledon singles ladies champion, and her record of 8 consecutive singles finals would stand until 1990 when it was finally broken by Martina Navratilova. She died in Helensburgh, Scotland on October 10th, 1966 at the age of 96. So she lived a long time. She had a good long life. Did a lot of things. So that's commendable that she lived to such a great and late age. And then here's what's not so great. At least they finally did it, but it took until 2013 before she was inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame. And I don't know. I mean, to me, that seems like they kind of waited a bit too long because she died in 1966 and then 2013. I'm not great at math, but that's a long time to wait for
No,
someone who accomplished as
it's
much
way too
as
long.
she did. Yeah, way too long. But she is in the International Tennis Hall of Fame now, as she deserves to be. And again, kind of like Elena, part of why we decided to cover both of them in this episode is just we're limited in the amount of information we have about these women because not a ton was being written about them. And even in the research I did, you kind of saw the same facts repeated over and over again. So, you know, we're not trying to
Yeah.
diminish their life stories by covering 2 women in one episode. It's just that's kind of what we have to do, unfortunately, with what we know about them. And also, Sarah, I felt like it was important to cover both because their accomplishments, while equally great, are different. Elena being the first modern female Olympic champion
Yeah.
as part of a boating crew, and then Charlotte as the first individual. I just feel like, that's different, and they both need to be remembered for their accomplishments.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just happy that we're finally able to cover women competing um,
Mm-hmm.
in
Yeah.
sports, even though Pierre de Coubertin was not ecstatic about the idea. So, yeah, I'm happy that we have female Olympic champions other than Kyneska to talk about now.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, so we'll be able to see a growth occur in the number of women that compete in the Olympic Games. Unfortunately, the legacy is still it takes a lot longer for female sports to get added to the roster. But we are going to start to catch up a little bit, which is good
Yeah,
news.
definitely. Yeah, women's sports has come a long way since these two amazing ladies competed at the 1900 games. But like you said, there's still more that can be done, and we'll grow. We'll get more and
Yeah.
more. A lot of it really comes down to visibility and opportunity. We need more coverage of women in
Mhm.
sports, so we are going to be committed to making sure we cover female athletes equitably on our little show, at least as much as we can. Same thing, I think eventually you'll hear us talking about Paralympic athletes a lot more.
Yeah.
It's just that right now in 1900, there's not Paralympics to cover. But
Right.
yeah, so I'm happy that now we're starting to see more and more females, and I look forward to the other females that we will get to cover.
Yeah. And that's why it was important to talk about Charlotte Cooper's story because there was no Paralympic movement. And it's important to show that, people with disabilities, unfortunately, they've been pushed to the fringe of society throughout history. and their stories have been left out. And so we have an opportunity with Charlotte to highlight a woman who was living with a disability and succeeding in a sport and succeeding as a woman in a time where that would not have been expected of her. And so it's important to highlight people who were accomplishing those things before there was a movement for them to actually be a part of. So yeah. And I think it's also important for us to note, by the way, that in the most recent Winter Olympics and Winter Paralympics for Team USA, at least, our female athletes brought home more medals than the men did. Just saying, just going to throw that out there. And I promise we'll stop preaching about this, or maybe we shouldn't make that promise. If you enjoyed this episode,
and we really hope you did,
then we hope you'll go check out our website, gamesodyssey.com. Or if you're more of the social type, well, Sarah, where can people find us?
You can find us on Instagram at Games Odyssey Pod, on Twitter at Games Odyssey Pod, and on Facebook, The Games Odyssey, where we also post news and videos that we find interesting and think that you'll like.
Yeah, and the Facebook page is a good place to interact for sure. I don't like social media. About the only one I probably interact with on a regular basis is Facebook. So get ready for some fun posts on there, because next week I need to take a break to mentally prepare for the 1904 St. Louis Games. So before we get into that debacle, we're going to have a really special wildcard episode where we're going to blend together two of my most favorite things, the Olympics and Paralympics and movies. But until then, I'll see you later. The Games Odyssey podcast is a production of Wardrobe Media, LLC. This episode was written, hosted, produced, and edited by Jonathan Jordan and co-hosted by Sarah Patton. Show notes, including research sources and transcripts, can be found on our website, gamesodyssey.com. Olympic is a trademark of the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, USOPC. Any use of Olympic in the Games Odyssey podcast is strictly for informational, commentary, and educational purposes. The Games Odyssey podcast is not an official podcast of the USOPC and is not sponsored, endorsed, or officially affiliated with the USOPC or the International Olympic Committee or International Paralympic Committee. The content of Games Odyssey podcast does not reflect the opinions, standards, views, or policies of the USOPC, and the USOPC in no way warrants that content featured in the Games Odyssey podcast is accurate.